Mr Chair.
Call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much. Mr Chair, Kelvin Davis made some very interesting points in that, and that is we can't just accept because a minister has said that this is non-controversial, that in fact it is non-controversial. And he brought up some really good points. There's one I would also like to bring up as well, Mr Chair, and that is clause 32. We talk about the Braemar Hospital site, and I alluded to this in my second reading speech, but what it says is Braemar Hospital site A, that's site A, freed from endowment and reservation. And 32.1 talks about the endowment affecting the Braemar Hospital site is cancelled. And the concern I have about this, Mr Chair, is first and foremost, what led to the endowment of this parcel of land to the hospital, and if it was actually endowed by a private citizen who wanted to ensure that land was only used for health purposes, I wonder if in fact there is any documentation at all that says, which is often the case, that if the hospital board sells it off or does not use or uses it for anything other than health purposes, then it must return to the original owner or the descendants of the original owner. And when I see this sort of thing, Mr Chair, it does concern me slightly to wonder if we have gone through the correct process. Because, of course, the last thing we want to end up is back in Parliament here trying to retrospectively compensate some descendant of the original owner who endowed it to the hospital site. We go down to 33. Again, it's the Braemar Hospital site B, freed of trust and reservation. Again, I ask the same question, and the answer may be completely innocuous, and that is, has the proper process been followed by the hospital board in terms of consulting those who put this land into reserve or endowed it at some point in time? The other thing that's also interesting, Mr Chair, is clause 39. And this is one of these bills, Mr Chair, you can look through every clause and you can say, OK, that sort of makes sense. We get the reason why they're doing it. But again, it's about proper process. Because as mentioned, the last thing we want, or the last thing that the Port Chalmers Recreation Reserve wants, is to end up in a situation where there's a piece of legislation has validated what they want to do, but then they find the original deed of gift or something and go, oh goodness me, we were supposed to offer this back. And the only remedy to that is actually bringing it back to Parliament or a private member's bill or something that allows compensation. And that's a worst case scenario. I'm not saying it's going to happen, Mr Chair, but I'm just saying it'd be good to know if the proper process has been followed. And if we look at Port Chalmers Recreation Reserve, what actually happened here, Mr Chair, is a parcel of land was granted the reserve to the Port Chalmers Borough Corporation, which I'm assuming doesn't exist anymore, in trust as a domain with the restriction that the land not be sold or leased. But what happened is in 2001, despite that prohibition, the Port Chalmers Borough Corporation actually leased that land out to a bowling club. So a bowling club was put in place. And this comes back to my whole point around the process. Now, they wouldn't have done this to be disingenuous, or they wouldn't have been, they weren't trying to be devious in any way, shape or form. All that happened is, I'm assuming, well, I'm making this assumption, but I'm assuming what happened is they didn't understand or they didn't know that this restriction was actually in place. So they granted the lease. Yeah, and what happened is at some point in time, someone was going through a whole lot of documentation and said, oh, goodness me, we weren't allowed to do this. We're going to be in a little bit of trouble here. Let's put this into a reserves and other lands disposal bill just to bring it in line with legislation so they weren't doing anything illegal or an illegal activity wasn't still on the books. And we get that. We're not saying that this is the wrong thing to do, but what it does highlight is it is very easy, well, not very easy. What does happen in times is local body authorities acting in good faith, or hospital boards, or even the Crown, often acting in good faith, can be unaware without doing a little bit of research that these sort of prohibitions exist. And so what happens is they grant a lease or something along these lines, a bowling club is established at great expense, and what could happen, technically what could happen is they could say, sorry, we made a mistake, the lease is void because this was done under an Act of Parliament, therefore the land has to be returned to the original owner, i.e. the Port Chalmers Corporation at that point in time. We don't want to see that, and that's why we have these bills, but I'm just saying how these sorts of things can actually occur here. So now what we're doing is, in this piece of legislation with this, is we're saying that the lease was granted. Mr Chair?
I'm sorry, the members used all his calls. I call Paul Foster Bell.